Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Office of Research Institutional Review Board Training, Protecting Research Participant Data. I am Tiffany Willoughby, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research. I will be your moderator. Joining me today to deliver the period of instruction is Amanda Boone, Institutional Review Board Director. Available to assist and answer any additional questions as needed are Mary Beth Goodnight, Institutional Review Board Specialist, and Yesenia Mendez, Institutional Review Board Specialist. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, Tiffany, and thank you for that introduction. So as Tiffany indicated, I am Amanda Boone, and I am the director of the IRB office here at UT Dallas. And today we're going to talk about certificates of confidentiality. If at any point there are any questions at all, please feel free to type those into the chat so that we can best get you the information that you need. So at any point, I will stop momentarily or I will stop in between some of the slides and some of the information to see if we do have any questions. So just the agenda today, we will start with the background of just like anytime I give a presentation, I kind of like to give the background of why, how we got to certificates of confidentiality and what brought them about. We'll talk about what is a certificate of confidentiality, the limitations for those, and then how are they issued? And then there are just some additional guidance from some of the agencies. Oh, not sure why this is not working for me. Tiffany, I might need you to, do you have the slide deck?
Yes, ma'am. Why don't I go ahead and pull those up for you, and then you can call next slide. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Will do. No problem. And audience members, thank you for your patience. We will be with you again momentarily. And we are live, Amanda.
Great, thank you so much. So we can go down to the next slide. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first thing I want to talk about is the background, and there's really two pieces of legislation that came about. The 21st Century Cures Act is what you see on the slide. That really came out to amend a previous act, which is the Public Health Service Act. That was really for the protection and privacy of individuals who are research subjects. And according to the Public Health Service Act, any individuals who are engaged in research, whether that be biomedical, behavioral, clinical, other types of research, if you are collecting information from them that identifies them and you're asking those sensitive questions, they deserve to be protected, their privacy and all of that. So, but that's really what the Public Health Service Act was put in place for. And then the 21st Century Cures Act amended that. And it said, you know, not only do we need to have protection, but we need to kind of reduce some of the administrative burden on investigators that kind of might reduce the number of certificates of confidentiality that are actually submitted, that are actually put in place to actually protect those participants. So it really wanted to get rid of that administrative burden of the actual request for those certificates. And it required the NIH to issue a certificate of confidentiality to every federally funded researcher who collects research participant identifiable information. And just to kind of give a brief understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about identifiable sensitive information. It could either be a direct identifier, so that could be like the name, the email address, that type of thing that links that information to that individual, or it can be a biospecimen. There's no information to it. There's no identifiers on it, but it is you can actually figure out who somebody is from a blood sample or something like that. So that second piece that kind of speaks to that biospecimen is if there's at least a very small risk, and I'm quoting from the Public Health Act, there's at least a very small risk that some combination of the information can then be used to deduce the identity of an individual. So whether that be that biospecimen, or whether it just be I have de-identified information, but some combination of that information, if it were to be made public, you could deduce who a person is. And I thought it was interesting that the Public Service Health Act said that there is at least a very small risk. So even if it seems that nobody can be identified from this research project, and if it is at, even just a little tiny bit possible, then that needs to be protected. Next slide, please. So the certificates of confidentiality, what particularly are those? They do protect privacy, but how? They really prohibit investigators from being compelled to release information. So what it really is geared for and aimed at are, like if you were subpoenaed by a court of law, and that can be at any level. That can be federal, local, state, at any level. You cannot be compelled to release information. So that's the main point when we're talking about that protection, is that somebody can't come in and just say they want to find out mental health history. Subpoenaing research records would be a really easy way to get that whatever it is that somebody's looking for to be used against a participant. So that's why it's really important to protect. When we're talking about sensitive research studies, I'm sure a lot of people on this training understand a lot of them, but just for some examples, if you're working with HIV and AIDS and other STDs, that type of information, what it is they're looking to protect something that can harm somebody financially, somebody, their employability, whether their current position now or future employment, their insurance, if their insurance would be negatively affected in any way, or their ability to obtain insurance, or if there is some sort of reputation harm that will come to an individual. That's the type of information. So it's research on AIDS, HIV, STDs. I think you can also include a lot of other medical research, medical conditions into that as well that have stigma on them. Studies that collect information on sexual attitudes, preferences, or practices would be another one. Use of alcohol, drugs, or other addictive substances. Illegal activity, illegal conduct. So these types of things are what the Certificate of Confidentiality is pertaining to. Are there limitations? Of course, there are going to be some limitations. And those are really kind of geared towards voluntary disclosure. So it really is if the investigator wants to release information about the research subjects, it's not a way to get around if a participant were to disclose that there's child abuse going on in the home, or something that investigators are ethically obligated to report. It's not that type of protection that's being talked about here. So that would be a voluntary disclosure of that. If a participant comes in and says, I'm going to rob a bank tomorrow afternoon, that's something that an investigator would be ethically obligated to kind of disclose to law enforcement. So those types of things are not protected under the Certificate of Confidentiality. And then there's also the information that is included in the consent form. So if you know that you're going to be disclosing it in information in a certain way, put it in the consent form. The participant is then aware of that, and they're signing the consent form. They understand that information is going to be used in certain ways, and it's a voluntary disclosure at that point, and the participant is consenting to that. If there were to be other types of, let's say you were subpoenaed and the participant then said, no, it's okay, you can release that information, then the investigator could release that information in that particular instance because the participant has actually consented to that and said it's okay to do so. And then the Certificate of Confidentiality, of course, it doesn't protect against the unintentional breaches of confidentiality. So it's just really good to put into place additional protections, such as the way that information is stored and access and all of that fun stuff. So it doesn't, of course, protect against that because that would be unintentional. Next slide, please. So how are conflicts of certificates of confidentiality issued? One of the things that the 21st Century Cures Act, one of the things that came about from that was, they wanted to kind of take out the administrative burden. They said NIH has to give, if it's funded by the NIH, you have to give them to, you have to give it out and make those available. So they're automatically issued. So if you receive NIH funding for a study, and I believe this was as of December the 13th, 2016, NIH automatically, for those awards, you are automatically given a certificate of confidentiality. You don't have to actually submit an application. So before the December 2016, you actually did. You had to go in and submit a request for it, and then kind of put all that information in. And I think you were usually awarded a certificate of confidentiality, but you had to go through those steps. So now it's automatic. So a lot of the funding agencies will automatically give certificates of confidentiality if they do, in fact, issue those. And then there are, of course, the discretionary certificates of confidentiality, where you might not have federal funding, or and so then you can go in and make a request. NIH is the one that I am most familiar with, just because they are the ones that we typically see in our office and in our institution. And you can actually go in and request those certificates of confidentiality. There's an application process to do so. The limitations for that for NIH is that it has to be related to some sort of health has to be kind of under the NIH and what their organization is there to fund and to look into. So it would have to be health related for the NIH to actually issue those. Are there any questions right now, Tiffany?
There are no questions in the queue at this time, but we certainly welcome them from the audience members. Thank you.
Okay. The next slide, please. So there are some additional requirements. Once you get that certificate of confidentiality, it is really important that you put language into the consent, the informed consent. And that language is really just saying, hey, we are, the research that is being conducted here is funded by the NIH, or maybe it's not funded by the NIH, but it's issued a certificate of confidentiality, excuse me, by the NIH, and that it protects against, you know, everything that we've talked about. It protects against a forced disclosure, being compelled to disclose. However, it you want to kind of put in those limitations. So if you disclose some things, there are some things that I can't keep confidential that I do have to kind of disclose. And then just so that they're aware. One of the things I forgot to mention is that the certificate of confidentiality does not prevent, is not a way to get around getting audited by the funding agency. So if you are at NIH, if you have funding from NIH, they can still come down and audit your records. And that would be some of the language that would be part of the disclosure in the consent form. NIH does provide some template language that should go into the consent form. And so if you are NIH funded, you're going through the IRB process, just keep that in mind. If I am collecting the sensitive, if I'm collecting identifiers, if there's any way that people can be identified from this information, maybe I need to put that language into my consent form to just notify participants. So if there was a, one of the things is that PIs, the certificates of confidentiality aren't necessarily given, they aren't given to institutions, they're given to individuals. So if the principal investigator on an award were to move to a different institution, the research was staying at UT Dallas, the NIH would just need to be notified to let them know that the principal investigator that requested, or the principal investigator has left the institution, and it's a new individual now. So there are some instances where you do need to kind of be in contact with the agency that has issued the certificate of confidentiality, and that would be one where the transfer of PI responsibilities from one individual to another. Another thing is if the scope of the project has changed, or if anything has changed that is a particularly relevant, then you would need to then notify the issuing agency as well, and just let them know about the significant changes. I think that's how they say it, significant change to the project, the modification of the study. Once a certificate of confidentiality is issued for a project, it does expire. They are issued, but there are certain time limits. If it is issued under an award, then the information that is collected under that award is going to be covered for the life of that study. So anytime you're asking for no cost extensions or anything like that, it is still an active certificate of confidentiality. Once the project is over, the protections that are given under the certificate of confidentiality will never expire. It's just the length under which you can collect data that is protected. That's what is expiring. If you have a certificate of confidentiality that's issued today, you collect data and you have that data for 40 years, it's covered. It doesn't matter because you collected it under a certificate of confidentiality, and that protection never does expire. It is important to know that if you are collecting data and you are issued a certificate of confidentiality, as long as if you're not funded by the NIH, if you're not funded and they come and they give you a certificate of confidentiality, it will have a term on it. It will expire after a certain period of time. If it does expire, you can ask for a renewal. You can ask for it to be renewed. If there is a lapse for maybe it takes a little bit for them to go through the administration of looking at your renewal application. Make sure you do not collect data after that certificate is expired, because once it's expired, if you collect data after that, it's not covered under that certificate, even when it's renewed. So if there is that gap, you want to make sure that you're not collecting that data. If you do have a certificate of confidentiality, I kind of talked about that, just let the IRB office know so that we can make sure that the correct language is in the consent form. Are there any questions, Tiffany?
Yes, we do have one question in the queue, and it is a clarification question. Just to make sure I understand correctly, one certificate is issued at the study level covering all participants. Is that correct?
Yes, all participants under the study, yes. And so if you have a certificate that is given under a funded study, all the data that you collect for that study, for that funded study, is protected. Absolutely. Yes, if it is not funded, you still get that certificate of confidentiality. All the data that you collect, regardless of which participant, it's still covered as long as it's an active certificate of confidentiality. There will be an expiration date on that, and once that, let's say it expires in June, don't collect data in July unless you have a renewal. If you don't get that renewal until August, make sure that you don't collect data during July and part of August before it is renewed, if that makes sense. I hope that clarified it. Didn't make it muddier.
Thank you, Amanda. And at this time, there are no additional questions in the queue. No
additional questions. I'm trying to think about if there's anything that I didn't talk about, because that is pretty much my presentation. I do have some, if you go to the next slide, Tiffany. I do have some guidance. So for FDA guidance, there's a link for documents there, and then a NIH guidance, it's just the user guide. I believe it's to help, I think it's to help go through the submission process, I believe. The online certificate of confidentiality system user guide, I think is what that one is. It is important to know, one thing that I didn't talk about is if you are a multi-institutional study and the investigator, you're going, I'm getting ahead of myself. My brain is just going a million miles an hour. But if you're a multi-institutional study and you have a collaborator, a sub-awardee, it's important that you let them know that about the certificate of confidentiality, especially if you are not funded by the NIH, so that they understand the requirements of that and can be cognizant of that. It is awarded for the study, and so you don't. I said earlier that it's awarded to one person, which it is. Usually, if it's the primary person who is in charge of the data, you don't need to get multiple certificates of confidentiality for a study. So you don't need everybody in your lab to get a certificate of confidentiality. It goes through the PI, and I believe that's really all that you need.
Amanda, there is another question in the queue. Are there any specific guidelines regarding certification of confidentiality when working with minors?
I'm trying to I don't think that there's anything that differs for minors. No, I don't think there's anything that would differ for a minor as opposed to an adult. I think, again, when you're working with minors, there is a possibility that some information can come up that you do need to disclose. You need to be able to because you're ethically obligated to disclose it if there's abuse going on in the home and that type of thing. But I don't think there's additional considerations when a child is when you're collecting data on a child versus an adult.
All right, Amanda, it doesn't appear that there are any additional questions in the queue. Thank you for offering this period of instruction. Colleagues, thank you for attending today. Additional Office of Research information, event registration, and so much more can be found at research.utdallas.edu. Thank you.